Hey, I'm Sadi and welcome to Sadi's Tea. SSSS.GRIDMAN is not a topic I get to tackle much on this channel. I'm known to do Gundam models, Bokyaba figures, MILFs. But Gridman was always an important part of Sadi's Tea. And now that we just entered a new year, I want to start off strong by talking about some of the luckiest finds I have in my collection. The Figma SP114 Gridman and the Figma SP115 Gridknight. Two figures that are essentially the same, but each boasts a unique character that makes for quite an interesting comparison, so I decided to tackle both of them at once. And I say they're lucky finds as these two figures were released all the way back in 2019 and haven't gotten a rerun. Only limited edition recolors and retools, so the fact that I even have them in hand feels nothing short of a dream for me. Both figures are packaged in the back then standard Figma boxes, a giant window up at front with some space for some info, and both boxes have this really nice Subaraya authenticity sticker. And I guess it's pretty obvious from the background that my Figma Gridknight's footage is actually from ages ago now, before I got that background change, so please bear with me on this for a bit. Both the sides and the back of the box features promotional images of the figure with a bunch of legal text on the bottom of the backside. The top and the bottom of the box are exactly the same per figure. Upon opening the boxes, it's very much what we're still used to even up to this day. The figures of course comes packaged inside of a plastic clamshell, but before we get into that, most of the accessories are taped onto the back of the shell. That includes the hands on the clear Figma hand tree, the Figma accessory bag, the Figma Gridman has an optional blade but that's something we'll get into later, and of course the all-important Figma stand. The stand is also what we're used to seeing. Swivel at the base with 3 hinge joints and a 3mm adapter peg that goes into the back of the figure. That keeps them both stood up strong so we can see that the Figma Gridman and Gridknight are amazing renditions of the character. But let's focus on Gridman here for a bit since they are mostly the same sculpt and this figure just looks so great. Immediately your eyes are drawn to its distinctive design decisions that deviates heavily from the CGI model. Instead, the sculptors chose to base it off the exaggerated 2D illustrations of Gridman, much to the style of legendary mecha artist Masami Obari, known for his iconic, bold, and powerful illustrations, with roaring geometry and the top-heavy build of a fighter. To be specific, since this is a Sadi's Tea video after all, the 2D illustrations of Gridman a lot of us are familiar with are typically credited to Hiroki Mutaguchi, another famous mecha artist known for their exorbitant displays. And so, Gridman here is stylistically altered with a stronger, chunkier build and more angular pronounced shapes, in turn making the looks of the figure far from the typical Toku Henshin hero and more in the vein of macho mecha super robots. And the bright and cheery color scheme with the shiny silver and toyetic accent colors brings out all of the really great detailing on the figure, making this one hell of an eye-catching piece in the collection. But what if you slap on a pair of Kamita glasses on this guy, give it some bunny ears, and paint it in a color scheme oh so familiar to this channel? Well, then you get the Figma Gridknight. Again, essentially the same figure, but honestly, between the two, I find that Gridknight's much more aesthetically pleasing. Not just because I'm biased to the purple and orange, or the fact that it's Gridknight, who's quite important to this channel, but it all comes down to just how balanced the aesthetic angular geometry is, and frankly, I feel like the head of the Figma Gridman is just a bit too excessive. Like his eyes are tiny and look at his crimson chin ass over here. Bye-bye. The addition of Gridknight's swooping bunny ears and visor adds a lot to balance out the exaggeration on the head, especially the side profile wherein the chin doesn't seem as pronounced, thanks to the counteraction of the spikes on the opposite side of the head. And the general sharp and aggressive aesthetics with the angry shoulders, pointy edges, and imposing proportions are just more befitting of Gridknight's character, the badass counterpart to the good guy Gridman. Although I do think the head works better for Gridknight, there is one issue that kinda threw me off, and if you've already spotted it, then great job! You're as Gridman brain-rotted as I am. So, the energy lamp here is painted on as a metallic green when really it should be blue. The probable reasoning behind this is because this was the paint they used on Gridman and somebody on the coloring team must have not noticed or cared about this change in color. But hey, if there was anything I cared about Evangelion, it's that green and purple is a great color scheme, so this won't keep me up at night. I hope. While on the topic of imperfections, in terms of its manufacturing quality, the figures do have a few little mishaps here and there, like the paint isn't exactly the cleanest, there's a few little puck marks here and there, there's mold lines on a few parts like the chin that's back for another round of scrutiny. Hell, my Gridknight just straight up had a paint chip on the bicep right out of the box. but these mostly are just realities of mass-produced figures that you can't really avoid all too much. Hell, robot Damashi figures have seam lines, so really these aren't all too bad, especially since from a distance, they kinda just blend into the rest of the aesthetics. And what you get are some incredibly dynamic looking figures that looks like they're just begging to be put into some awesome poses. And my god, did these things get into poses so damn well. GRIDMAN and Gridknight's insane flexibility was translated into the figure's articulation scheme quite well by adding some new types of joints to the Figma formula, which, if you're not aware of, typically Figma figures use what collectors like to call a Figma joint, a single hinge joint with two pegs on opposite sides that can be used for swivels. It's not the only joint that Figma uses. I mean, GRIDMAN here just uses a typical ball joint on the head before moving to the hinge and peg, but you do get a Figma joint placed at an extreme point on the neck so that we have this overly excessive downwards range. I love this thing. There's a swinging butterfly joint on the torso that definitely wouldn't have been possible if they kept the shoulder circle in place. I've brought this point up before in my Tron model GRIDMAN review from all the way back then, and I'll probably have to address this every single time I do my rare GRIDMAN video, but the circular piece in front of the shoulder joint had to be moved onto the shoulder pads for articulation, which does get a bit of my accuracy nuts' nerves, but this was how it was done on the original 1993 costume, so really I can't forgive this. And also, be a bit cautious when handling the shoulder area. The butterfly joint just uses a single peg that might get easily stressed out when you use the ball joint and hinge on the shoulders, which allows for full rotation and a bit of outwards movement on the shoulders. Though, if you move the shoulder pads, ball joint, and hinge combo, you can get the arms to move out more and just generally get more range. With this combo joint, it's also on this diagonally molded piece that can rotate on a horizontal axis, which aids a lot in making the poses look a lot more natural, since if the shoulder pads were stationary, I'd think they look a bit awkward. Yet, so far, I don't think I've seen any other English review mention this, so at least it only took 5 years. Technically, in terms of accuracy to the design, the arms are faced incorrectly. Swiveling the bicep, forearm, or moving around the standard wrist assembly won't fix this discrepancy, but in all honesty, this orientation for the arms does make the single bend at the elbow much nicer, so I actually do like it. Not a huge fan of how GRIDMAN's elbow panel lines aren't filled up like here on Gridknight's. What's up with that? The body crunches, arcs, tilts, and turns gorgeously because of that tiny lower abdomen. The hips are on a ball joint that lets you move the legs back not all too well, outwards being pretty alright, though a bit limited by the thigh armor, which is in all honesty a bit of a nightmare to work around design-wise, but the forwards movement kicks up at an angle strangely enough. No worries, you can just use the ball joints on the thighs to circumvent this. An odd system for the hips, but it does do the job. The knees move almost 180 degrees, with the shape of the thighs flowing quite well with the bend. Supposedly, this sharp knee armor does stay on the thigh when bent, but I'm not all too surprised that Figma went the easy route and didn't include this detail, but I think it honestly benefits the figure, since it adds extra geometry that really aids in making your poses look more dynamic. And it really reminds me of the Lancelot, and how I'm a sinner for not owning anything from Code Geass yet. God, I love that show. The feet are pretty average in movement, though I am a bit put off with the lack of the toe joints, quite easy to implement actual. And while the feet are quite small, you can actually balance the figure without the Figma stands. So, to summarize, the Figma GRIDMAN and Gridknight's articulation is nothing short of fantastic. You can get these figures into so many poses and look photogenic in each stance. There's very minimal in terms of limitations, and those limits are really more so due to the character design than being the fault of the figure. There is a bit of a learning curve with the unorthodox joints, but once you get the hang of it, nothing will stop you from getting some dynamic displays. Although, there are a lot of reports of the Figma Gridknight figure specifically being a bit unstable. A lot of other people's copies seem to have quality control issues where the joints would fall off the Figma joint pegs way too easily. But I guess I just got lucky since out of the box, I didn't really have any problems with my figure, nor have they gotten any worse in the several months of me playing around with Gridknight, and I've barely gotten my hands off this figure. The lovely fluidity of the joints just feels so satisfying to handle, and the impressive articulation really makes up for the lack of accessories, and both figures do come with essentially the same stuff, with GRIDMAN having a few little extras. Besides the default fist that you get right out of the box, the only other ones included are these incredibly dynamic spread hands, and your typical gripping hands. At first glance, It kind of feels like these won't get you much, but you'd be surprised just how well these hands get into poses, especially when you use the gripping hands to hold the Gridknight and Gridknight Kyariba. Loving that gorgeously lustrous cherry red on the Gridknight Kyariba complements the cool purple of the figure so well. And Gridman Kyariba is of course the more complete experience of Samurai Kyariba. It comes with a frontal axe piece that Gridknight Kyariba doesn't because of the events in episode 11 Decisive Battle. The axe was still on full power Gridman's chest if you were wondering, and no, the axe can't actually open up like in the Gattai sequence, but the sword is still incredibly accurate to the CGI model, so no complaints here. Technically it's not completely accurate since the back portion does have an opening, but that's because you can actually pull off the axe portion and the sword is actually packaged with them separated. So, if you wanted to, you could have Gridman and Gridknight sporting the same style sword, even if Gridman's is much longer for some reason, or since they are the same sculpt, you can mix and match parts to your liking, because both the blade and the hilt is detachable. Of course, the hilt is for when you want Gridman or Gridknight to hold onto their respective kyaribas by slotting the hilts into the gripping hands, and the handle is long enough for a double-handed grip, which is especially useful for Gridman, as you actually have the option to use this larger blade to create that classic over-the-top force perspective shot, aka the Brave perspective, or the Obari pose. If you're a mecha fan, then you know this thing to heart. It's inescapable and we wouldn't want it any other way. Just to show you how large this blade is, here it is next to the full sword and it's essentially the same size. And that covers all the accessories, and it's really not that plentiful of an amount. The lack of accessories might bother some collectors since I know you people love to complain about stuff like that. But if the lack of accessories really is a bother to you, then there is the Figma Gridknight for his appearance in SSSS.DYNAZENON. Basically the exact same figure again repainted, but with additional stuff like 2 more pairs of hands and the Gridknight Sakura. I'm a fucking nerd. And just last year we got the second Figma Gridman Primal Fighter, and yeah, they're named the exact same thing, definitely not confusing. It's a retooled version of this figure for his appearance in the SSSS.GRIDMAN compilation movie, and that figure came with a goody lightsaber hand. If those seem more like what you want, well, I wish you luck because those are a bit more expensive and harder to get than these figures, so happy collecting! My whole perspective on the accessories is that I do kinda get how this is a bit disappointing, since these are by all means Toku Henshin heroes. Well, more CGI than Toku, but you know what I mean. The fact that they don't have effect parts is a bit of a sin, but what we get is already great enough to get these guys into fantastic displays. It's not the most sizable lot of items, but it's still satisfactory enough for both figures. They're also not the most sizable of figures, but I actually find it to be quite satisfactory the fact that they're almost palm-sized. 16 centimeters make these guys large enough to be a noticeable piece in your collection, but small enough to easily handle around for posing, and I can take these guys wherever I want for pictures. That's always a great benefit. Though as for scale, Figma figures are usually non-scale, but it does come rather close to being around the 1 to 300 scale. To put the size of these figures into perspective, here's Gridknight with the Sadi size comparison trinity of the Figma style's female-bodied Shiaki, the FURIU Taharadarika, and the Seika PM figure Mamaho Oski. And here's Gridman next to the only other Gridman figures I have on display, the SMP Thunder Gridman set with the Hyper Agent Gridman and the God Zenon models. Man, I need more Gridman figures. Or better yet, they should make more Gridman figures, like where the hell is our Yuta Hibiki figure, god damn it! Tron model Gridman's currently under maintenance, so I can't bring them out for comparisons sadly, but I guess for one last comparison, here's the YOLO Park Mini AMK Optimus Prime. Christ, how long has it been since Transformers was a topic on my channel? Now admittedly speaking, I definitely come off with an air of bias since my soft spot for Gridman, and Gridknight especially, is quite well documented. But still, speaking with an objective sense, these figures are just really good. Dynamic in both looks and articulation, the accessories is definitely the most lacking aspect, quite literally. But it doesn't stop you from having just a wonderful time with these figures. If you love Gridman and Gridknight, these are incredibly great options for your collection, even if you only have one or the other, but it is one hell of a treat to see them both side by side. Maybe not the easiest figures to get since it has been quite a while since they came out, And on the secondary market, they do cost a bit of a pretty penny, especially Gridknight. But that's just kind of the thing when it comes to figures. There's a reason why I mostly cover HGUC kits. And honestly, if you wanted these figures anyways, then I don't think these aftermarket prices are too bad for figures you'll love. But of course, I don't think I need to say it, but I really do love these figures. And that about finishes my review of the Figma Gridman and Gridknight, two of my favorite pieces in my entire collection, an array of hope for me doing more Gridman content in the future, especially with the upcoming new year. If you'd like to support what we do here on Sadi's Tea, consider giving this video a like, sharing the video around, and subscribing to the channel so you can catch up on all the latest reviews we have here on Sadi's Tea. Or you can check out my social media sites for earlier updates. All support is very much welcome. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way through, and I'll see you all in the next video. Thanks for stopping by for some tea.